They were going to pump gasoline into a car that didn't need it. That's how little the world understood what Charles H. Rhodes had built in 1934, somewhere in the forgotten flatlands of rural Ohio, in a workshop that smelled of machine oil and ambition and the peculiar loneliness of a man who was decades ahead of his time. Nobody remembers his name now. That's the thing about history. It doesn't always preserve the people who deserve to be remembered. Sometimes it buries them quietly, especially when powerful people decided that the buried version was more convenient. But for a few weeks in the late winter of 1934, Charles Rhodes was front-page news. Not because he succeeded, though he had. Not because his invention worked, though it did. He made front-page news because someone stole it. Someone who knew exactly what it was worth came in the dark of a February night and took the one thing Charles Rhodes had spent 11 years building. And after that, Charles Rhodes was never quite the same man again. This is his story. It is also, in a way, America's story. A story about what happens to visionaries when the world isn't ready for their vision, and about the strange, cruel irony that sometimes the most important things ever built are the ones that simply disappear. Charles Hamilton Rhodes was born in 1889 in Morrow County, Ohio, the second of 6 children, in a farmhouse where the roof leaked when it rained hard and where his father kept a Bible on the supper table and a bottle of rye whiskey in the barn. His mother, a school teacher before she married, gave him a gift that would define his entire life. She gave him the habit of asking why. Why did the lamp need kerosene? Why did the horse need oats? Why did everything that moved in the world need something to feed it before it would go? Charles asked these questions as a boy, wrote them into the margins of his school books, and carried them with him into adulthood like other men carried photographs of loved ones. By his early 20s, he was working as a machinist in Columbus, a quiet, precise man who rarely raised his voice and never made a purchase he hadn't thought about for at least a week. His coworkers described him as calm to the point of oddness, a man who seemed to be conducting an interior conversation at all times, as though his mind was always somewhere slightly different from his body. He married a woman named Edna in 1914. She was a practical woman, a farmer's daughter who understood that dreamers were fine as long as they came home for supper and paid the rent, which Charles mostly did. They had 2 children, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Ruth, and they rented a small house in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus. And by all appearances, Charles Rhodes was simply a working man of modest means navigating an ordinary life. But every evening after supper, Charles went to the garage. And in that garage, year after year, he was building something that had no name yet. The idea had come to him in 1921, watching a river. He had driven out to the Scioto River on a Sunday afternoon, Edna reading beside him in the Ford, the children sleeping in the back seat, and he had watched the current move past the rocks and thought about energy in a way that suddenly felt almost unbearably clear. Water moved without being told to. Wind moved without being told to. The earth itself, spinning in the dark of space, moved without being told to. So why, Charles Rhodes thought, why do our machines need to be told? It was not a new question. Inventors had chased perpetual motion since the Renaissance, and most had broken themselves on it. The physics were unforgiving. The laws of thermodynamics were not suggestions. Energy could not be created from nothing, and any machine that claimed otherwise was either a fraud or a fool's errand. Charles knew this. He was not an uneducated man. He had read extensively, more than most formally trained engineers of his generation, and he understood where the line was between the possible and the impossible. But he had also noticed something. He had noticed that the line was drawn in a particular place by people with particular interests, and that the territory just before the line, the territory of radical efficiency, radical energy recovery, radical compression and release cycles, that territory was largely unexplored. Not because it was impossible, but because it was unprofitable. What Charles Rhodes began building in 1921 was not a perpetual motion machine. He was clear about that in the notebook he kept, which Edna would later show to a journalist in 1934. A small blue composition notebook filled with calculations in Charles's neat, deliberate hand. What he was building was what he called, in his own private vocabulary, a closed-loop engine. An engine that consumed its own exhaust. An engine that recycled its own energy with enough efficiency that external fuel became, in practical terms, unnecessary. He worked on it for 11 years. 11 years of evenings and weekends, of saving money from his machinist's wages to buy components, of ordering specialized parts through catalogs and waiting weeks for their arrival, of building and failing and adjusting and building again. Edna later said she could tell which evenings had gone well and which had not by the sound of Charles's footsteps coming from the garage into the kitchen for his late cup of coffee. Quick steps meant progress. Slow steps meant another problem. In 1927, Thomas, their son, then 13 years old, began helping him. Thomas had his father's hands and his mother's directness, and according to Edna, he was the one who first got the early prototype to sustain itself for more than 30 seconds. 30 seconds of a machine running without external input. Charles reportedly stood in that garage for several minutes without saying anything, just listening to it run. They worked together through 1928, 1929, 1930. The Depression arrived and made everything harder, as it made everything harder for everyone in America. But it also gave Charles more time. The machine shop where he worked cut his hours, and though that meant less money, it meant more evenings free, and Charles used every one of them. By 1932, he had something that worked consistently. Edna described watching it run for the first time at full capacity as one of the strangest experiences of her life. She said it was the silence that struck her. She had expected noise, the clanking and combustion of a regular engine. What she heard instead was a low, sustained hum, almost musical, she said, like someone pressing a note on an organ and holding it. Charles decided he needed to put it in a car. He bought the chassis of a 1928 Franklin automobile from a junkyard for $8. The Franklin was unusual in that it used air cooling rather than water cooling, which appealed to Charles for reasons that had to do with the way his engine managed temperature. He spent most of 1932 and part of 1933 adapting his engine to the Franklin chassis, working with Thomas, who was by then 18 and deeply invested in the project. By the summer of 1933, they had driven it. Not far, just around the block in Clintonville on a Tuesday evening when the neighbors were inside listening to the radio. But they drove it. Charles sat in the driver's seat. Thomas stood on the running board holding a flashlight, and Edna watched from the porch with her arms crossed and her heart somewhere in her throat. It ran. It ran without gasoline. It ran without any external fuel source at all, drawing on the closed-loop system Charles had spent 11 years developing, sustaining itself through a compression and recovery cycle that he had refined through hundreds of iterations. He drove it a mile that first evening, then 2 miles. Then, the following Saturday morning, he drove it 16 miles out to Sunbury and back, and when he came home, Edna was crying, though she would have been furious if you'd pointed that out to her. Charles was not a man given to celebration. He sat down at the kitchen table, drank a cup of coffee, and looked at the wall for a while. Then he said quietly that he thought they ought to tell someone. This decision, the decision to tell someone, would turn out to be the great tragedy of Charles Rhodes's life. He did not rush into it. He was careful, methodical even. He consulted a lawyer in Columbus, a man named Gerald Tisch, who drew up a provisional patent application in the fall of 1933, though the formal filing was delayed, as these things often were, by costs and paperwork and the general bureaucratic friction of the era. He wrote letters to two engineering professors at Ohio State University, neither of whom replied. He approached a local businessman named Everett Callaway, who had money and who Charles thought might be interested in backing the technology's development. Callaway was interested, very interested, too interested as it would turn out. Callaway brought other men to see the vehicle over the winter of 1933 and 1934. Men whose names Charles didn't know, men in good suits who arrived in expensive cars and watched the demonstration runs without saying much and asked very precise questions about the engine's internal specifications, questions that Charles, trusting in the process, answered honestly. Edna would later say she had a bad feeling about those men from the beginning. She said they had the eyes of accountants, men calculating what something was worth rather than what it meant. On the 14th of February 1934, Valentine's Day, Charles woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of his garage door. By the time he got outside, the car was gone. Not just the car. The engine was gone. The notebooks, copies of them anyway, he had more, were disturbed. The workshop had been entered with professional precision. Not ransacked, but methodically examined. The work of people who knew what they were looking for. Charles stood in the empty garage in the dark Ohio winter, and Edna stood behind him in her housecoat. And Thomas came out a moment later with his jaw set in the way he had when he was trying not to show what he was feeling, and nobody said anything for a long time. The theft made the Columbus papers the next day, and then the wire services picked it up. And for 2 weeks in February 1934, the story of Charles Rhodes and his gasoline-free automobile ran in newspapers across the country. The coverage was a peculiar mixture of wonder and skepticism, many reporters treating it as a human interest curiosity, the kind of eccentric garage inventor story that Americans loved, while others raised the possibility that something genuinely important had been taken. The Columbus Police Department investigated. They interviewed Callaway, who was cooperative, perhaps too smoothly cooperative, and produced an alibi and expressed outrage and professed complete ignorance. They never identified the thieves. The car was never recovered. The patent application was still pending, which meant that the technology existed in a legal gray zone, documented but not protected, described but not secured. Charles's lawyer advised him that the situation was extremely difficult. Without the physical evidence of the machine itself, proving what it could do was nearly impossible. Charles filed the patent. It was eventually granted in 1935 for what the patent language described as a closed-cycle mechanical propulsion system with internal energy recovery. But the patent was for a design that was now unverifiable. The machine that had proved the design was gone. And without a working prototype, no investor would commit money to build another one, because the story of a man whose miracle invention had been stolen in the night was, to most practical people, simply too strange to be credible. There is a particular kind of defeat that doesn't announce itself all at once. It comes in increments. Charles Rhodes continued. He rebuilt what he could from memory and from the notes he retained. He applied for funding and was rejected. He tried to interest the government, writing letters to agencies whose names suggested they might care about such things, and received form letter replies. He approached journalists, and some wrote about him again, with the gently patronizing tone that publications adopted when covering men who were either visionary or deluded, and whom the journalists couldn't quite determine which. The automobile industry, by 1934 and 1935, was consolidating rapidly. The major manufacturers had deep ties to the petroleum industry. The economics of the country ran on gasoline, and the people who ran those economics were not interested in a quiet machinist from Clintonville who claimed to have built something that threatened the whole arrangement. Thomas enlisted in the Army in 1936 and was later killed in the Pacific Theater in 1942. This loss, people who knew the family said, changed something fundamental in Charles. He had always been internal, private, a man who kept his deepest feelings in the same careful order he kept his tools. After Thomas died, the order seemed to go out of things. He kept working. He always kept working. But the purpose had shifted somehow, from ambition to something more like stubbornness or perhaps fidelity to Thomas, to the 11 years, to the thing itself. Ruth, the daughter, married in 1940 and moved to Cincinnati and kept in close contact with her parents, visiting when she could, watching her father grow quieter and more remote as the years accumulated. She later told her own children that her father never stopped believing he had built something real. He never stopped believing it had been taken from him deliberately, and he never stopped believing that the truth would eventually matter. Edna outlived Charles by 9 years. She died in 1974. Before she died, she gave Ruth the original composition notebook, the blue one with Charles's calculations, along with a small collection of photographs, including 2 remarkable ones taken by Thomas in the summer of 1933. The photographs show the modified Franklin automobile parked in front of the Clintonville garage, and Charles standing beside it in his work clothes, with the expression of a man who has just completed something he wasn't entirely sure was possible. He does not look triumphant in the photographs. He looks tired and satisfied and slightly bewildered. The way people look when something they've worked toward for a very long time has finally arrived, and the reality of it is stranger than the anticipation. Ruth kept the notebook and photographs in a cedar chest in her home in Cincinnati. Her children knew they existed. They knew the outline of the story. But life accumulates its own business, and decades passed, and the cedar chest sat in the attic of a house in a Cincinnati suburb while the world continued forward along the lines that Charles Rhodes had briefly, privately, spectacularly threatened to disrupt. What makes the story of Charles Rhodes remarkable is not just what he may have built. It is what his story illuminates about the relationship between invention and power in America, about the way the economic structures of an era determine which discoveries get to survive and which get taken in the night and buried somewhere no one can find them. The oil industry in 1934 was not a peripheral concern. It was the circulatory system of the American economy. The relationship between the automobile manufacturers and the petroleum companies was deeply symbiotic, mutually sustaining, and profoundly resistant to disruption. A technology that removed gasoline from the equation wasn't just a mechanical innovation. It was an existential challenge to a trillion-dollar arrangement. The men in good suits who came to watch Charles demonstrate his engine were not simply curious businessmen. They were, in all likelihood, representatives of interests that had very clear reasons to want the technology either acquired or eliminated. The theft in this context reads less like a crime of opportunity and more like a professional operation, tidy, targeted, and ultimately devastating. We will never know for certain. The police investigation produced nothing that survived in the public record. The men Calloway brought to the garage were never publicly identified. The car was never found. But here is what we do know. In 1935, the year after the theft, Everett Calloway acquired a significant ownership stake in a petroleum distribution company operating in central Ohio. He became a wealthy man over the following decade. He lived until 1968 and died in his sleep in a large house in Bexley, and his obituary mentioned his success in business and his philanthropic contributions to several Columbus institutions, and said nothing about a February night in 1934 or a quiet machinist or a garage in Clintonville. And here is what else we know. In 2001, Ruth's son, a man named David, was cleaning out his mother's house after her death and found the cedar chest in the attic. He opened it and found the notebook and the photographs and a collection of letters and documents related to his grandfather's patent. He spent several weeks reading through all of it. He told a local newspaper in Cincinnati, which ran a brief story about the find, that he had not known the full extent of what his grandfather had attempted. He had known the outline, the general shape of the story, but not the details, not the 11 years, not Thomas standing on the running board with a flashlight, not Edna on the porch with her arms crossed and her heart in her throat. David said that reading the notebook changed how he thought about his grandfather. He had known Charles as a quiet old man who sat in his chair and looked out the window a great deal in his later years. He had not fully understood what that silence contained. The notebook is now in the custody of a historical preservation organization in Ohio. The photographs have been digitized. The patent, filed in 1935, is a matter of public record, available to anyone who knows to look for it. A 23-page document in the careful, precise language of patent applications, describing a system that its inventor called a closed-loop mechanical propulsion system with internal energy recovery, language that is quietly extraordinary when you understand what it means. There is a version of the 20th century in which Charles Rhodes's car survived the night of February 14th, 1934, in which the patent was upheld and backed by capital and the technology developed and refined over the decades that followed, in which the name Charles Hamilton Rhodes appears in history books alongside the names of other men who changed how the world moves. It is a version of the century that never happened, that was prevented from happening by men in good suits arriving in the dark with professional intentions and a very clear understanding of what was at stake. Charles Rhodes died in 1965 in a Veterans Administration hospital in Columbus at the age of 75. His death was noted briefly in the Columbus Dispatch, a short obituary that mentioned his work as a machinist and his military service record and said nothing about an engine or a car or 11 years in a garage or a February night when something irreplaceable was taken from him. He was buried in Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus, in a modest grave marker that gives his name and his dates and the word husband above the name Edna on the stone beside his. When David, his grandson, visited the grave for the first time after finding the cedar chest, he stood there for a while and didn't say anything, which is perhaps what you do when you're standing over someone who deserved so much more from history than history bothered to give him. The blue composition notebook still exists. The calculations are still legible in Charles's neat, deliberate hand. Whatever they describe, whatever they prove or fail to prove by modern standards of verification, they are the record of a mind that asked why and then spent 11 years trying to answer the question in the quiet of an Ohio garage, in the evenings after supper, while the world went on about its business and didn't notice. We notice now. We just got here a little late.